Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. George Russell's future at Mercedes continues to be a massive point of contention, certainly after his crash with Max Verstappen at the Spanish Grand Prix last weekend. Toto Wolff's response was always going to be rather interesting, and the way that things have gone over the last couple of days indicates that while yes, there's still discussion about Russell getting a new deal, George himself makes it very clear that's exactly what he wants, but Toto Wolff as yet does not seem super willing to commit to that outcome. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. These are the two upcoming Grand Prix. Montreal in a couple of weekends' time, Austria after that, then we go straight into Silverstone. We may not have the remaining Canadian driver on the grid in Canada. Lance Stroll, due to his injury that he suffered, frankly, over the last 6 weeks, stretching back to the start of 2023, but especially in the last 6 weeks, according to sources, he had a major problem after qualifying, was not able to complete the Grand Prix, and we think on the following Monday underwent a, let's say, corrective surgery. Now, the big rumour therefore has been, is he going to be able to race in Canada? Just because Lance Stroll had a surgery and like a week later was back in the car in Bahrain, clearly in the long term, at least according to what Aston Martin said at the time, that hasn't really worked out. I doubt that even if his surgery is very effective and resolves quickly, they'll want to throw him straight back in the car. Look, Stroll's done, in terms of points scored, an excellent job this year so far for Aston Martin. Having him miss a couple of rounds just to make sure that he's okay might not be a bad idea. Drugovich would be the most likely replacement. Would be exciting to see him finally given the chance, I guess, just because, you know, many have said for years that it would have been nice for him to get the opportunity. Of course, won Formula 2, never got the chance in F1. Now, he didn't win F2 in the manner that some other drivers have won F2 by, you know, going back to back or winning it at the first time of asking. But nonetheless, I know lots of Brazilians, of course, and other fans of Drugovich wanted him to at least get a chance. That may now happen. Of course, it's not an easy thing to step into a car for the first time halfway through a season, but he will miss Le Mans if he has to race in Canada. And right now, that seems like a very realistic possibility indeed. Now, Drugovich would likely be the man to replace him because he's Aston's reserve driver, but, you know, he is racing Le Mans. Potentially, Aston could look for somebody else. Stoffel Van Dorn, Valtteri Bottas, among others, could be in consideration. We'll come back to Bottas in a second. Just one quick update. It's, you know, not going to blow your minds, but this is something the FIA have confirmed with the new technical directive. So in Spain, they were trialling that one of the cars would use the titanium skid block underneath. The other car would use the stainless steel. Now, the titanium is beautiful. It creates lots of sparks, as we know, that create some of the most glorious shots in F1. But in Japan this year, in China last year, we saw lots of grass fires break out. Primarily, at least that's what the FIA think, because of the sparks coming off the skid block in the car and letting the grass catch fire. Now, of course, there are other ways to resolve the issue, but they were playing around with a stainless steel block instead that would spark less and not reduce, you know, basically reduce this problem. They've decided after this Grand Prix in Spain, after doing this side-by-side test, that actually they're not going to change anything. They're going to stick with titanium for the rest of the year, but they did tell the teams, make sure you've got the stainless steel one just in case, because if they have a weekend where what happened in Japan recently and in China before that happens again, then they potentially will mandate those. So I guess their conclusion is that they prefer the titanium for some reason, but on certain weekends where that could be an issue, the stainless steel potentially provides a lesser opportunity of that occurring. That's the very exciting technical update of the day out of the way. Valtteri Bottas is talking about his future. He's, of course, a Mercedes man again. He has, to our understanding, been relatively crucial in helping develop Kimi Antonelli this year. Been one of his primary coaches, which is, you know, nice to imagine, but he wants to get back on the grid, and that's not going to happen at Mercedes. It could happen at Cadillac. That's, of course, a talking point. They're going to have Ferrari engines. They're coming in next year. We're 90% sure they're going to have Sergio Perez, but I would say that's not especially guaranteed because in recent weeks we've started to hear rumours that actually Alpine are interested in Perez. And look, if you're Perez and you have the choice, do I go to Alpine, Mercedes powered, or do I go to Cadillac, Ferrari powered, but equally their first year in the sport? Look, Alpine is an attractive option. It's got to be said. They can produce a reasonably good chassis. Next year, their engine should be on point. And from Alpine's perspective, if Colapinto isn't delivering and Perez provides the same amount of sponsorship cash, if not more, and he's more experienced, more reliable maybe, then, it's something for them to consider as well. So, look, if you're Perez, I can see merits to both Alpine and Cadillac. I can certainly see disadvantages to both Alpine and Cadillac. But it's something that I think that's the only way. Like, to my understanding or just my general gut feeling on it is, because I think Cadillac want Perez for sure, given for various factors. I think the only way that he doesn't drive for Cadillac is if he drives for Alpine. Like, I think Perez will be back on the grid next year. 90% sure that's what we're going to see. Now, of course, if, let's say, Bottas is in that type of conversation as well, now look, does he bring the Perez sponsorship cash that he could bring to Alpine instead of Colapinto? No. So for Cadillac, I think his best chance, maybe Bottas, would potentially be that Perez gets the drive at Alpine. I don't know, like, what's more likely, right? Like, a Cadillac going to put together a Perez-Bottas lineup? It might honestly be pretty good, but it's not very exciting, is it, really? Like, as much as I like Bottas and, I'm excited to see how Perez does if he gets back on the grid, it's not really setting the world alight. I think they would want to have, ideally an American, but certainly a younger driver with some potential alongside a veteran like a Bottas or a Perez. So I think for Bottas, he probably needs to hope that Perez goes to Alpine, Bottas can get the Cadillac seat, and then maybe they just reunite the old Sauber lineup and bring back Guan Yu Zhou, because he's got maybe he's still got some potential in there, and he brings in the money from China. Couple of options. Bottas is certainly not saying I'm not interested, because he says, I think they have a few drivers on the list. I would imagine that my experience will help, so I hope I'm in a good position, and calls the arrival of the project a very interesting one, which I think says quite a lot, because he's not being like, wow, these guys are going to be rapid, they might win the championship. It's like, yeah, it's an interesting proposition. It's like, well, I'll take the seat if you've got one for me, I think is the option there. Now, Bottas would like the Red Bull seat. Ideally, right? I mean, that's where, if you look at the grid, you're not going to McLaren, you're not going to Ferrari, you're not going to Mercedes. So, of the top teams, Red Bull are the team to look for, unless you consider Aston Martin to be a potential threat. And even then, who really knows what happens in the near future? On that team, Lance Stroll could be out for good. Who knows? Max might go there, right? Like, there's some other options. But Red Bull's lineup certainly has always been, but will continue to be, open for interpretation in the coming years. And I do think that Bottas, as he was to Hamilton at Mercedes, on paper would be a very respectable, solid second driver to Max who wouldn't get in the way too much. And probably would, Bottas would probably have the mentality to be able to accept the fact on some level that he's not going to be at that pace, but he's going to do a job for the team. Now, Bottas gave a couple of comments on this and says that he thinks that he could provide value to Red Bull. And I think he could. But he made a very interesting comment, actually. It just got put down because, of course, they talked about this, whether he could have gone to the team this year, whether that was an option. But he says that got shut down quite quickly. I think there is a certain person's or a person within the Red Bull organisation that for some reason is not a big fan of mine. So what do you guys make of this comment from Bottas? Who do you think he's talking about? He obviously has a name in mind, and the key players really are Horner and Marco that call the shots, certainly from a driver perspective, or you might argue Max, but I don't know. I don't really buy the idea that Max would be concerned about Bottas or someone would be concerned that their championship challenge wouldn't really be there. I don't know. Intrigued to your perspective in the comments below. This I thought was interesting, comparing the driver standings last year to this year. Pretty fascinating how Yuki last year had 19 points. This year he is less than that, and he's been driving a Red Bull for most of the year. But yeah, Ferrari are probably the most notable one, really. Like, what the hell did they do in the off-season to go from there to where they were today? To be fair, shortly after this last year for Leclerc, they had a bit of a nightmare triple header, which really allowed McLaren properly back into the game. And even still this year, Ferrari are second in the constructors, which is kind of remarkable given what we look at on the right-hand side. Alonso still had a solid start to last season, and remarkable that Hamilton actually has more points this year than he did last year, despite what has felt like a particularly challenging start. But let's talk Mercedes, because big drama this weekend was mainly Max Verstappen induced, but certainly relevant for George Russell and Mercedes. This is the W16, I think, doing some testing on the 2026 Pirelli tyres. Now, notably, as the car rolls out of the garage here, you'll probably see, if you look at the rear wing, that is not a lot of downforce on the car, certainly not for a Barcelona spec. Now, there's a reason for that. When these teams do testing in 2026, they effectively use Monza spec setups because the cars are expected to have Monza spec downforce. So Russell was on the car yesterday. I think potentially Antonelli was in the car today, and he was on the 2024 KK. So this is last year's Mercedes, of course, which probably, if I look closely, I'd have been able to see from the, let's say the cannons on the back of the thing. But they were driving this car, Russell and Antonelli was, in 2026 tyres in Monza spec, did 136 laps, which is certainly plenty, given the Grand Prix distance around here was 66 Grand Prix laps. The fastest lap time was a 1:16.9. So interesting to think, like, was he pushing? Was he, were any of these like quali sim runs? Just to think about a little bit how much difference a Monza spec trim might make at a circuit like Barcelona, because his lap time in the W16 this year was a 1:11.8, and pole was 1:11.5 from Piastri, of course. So, way off the time. You're not expecting him to get close for multiple reasons, but thought it was interesting nonetheless. Antonelli's power unit, as we know, exploded, which caused all the drama that we got at the end of that Grand Prix. That power unit, according to Mercedes, is not recoverable. So, yeah, it's cooked. They're looking into it. They're still trying to figure out why. They will have a new power unit, therefore, for Antonelli in Montreal. And also they will have new parts on the car. So they do have a couple of upgrades they're bringing to Canada. I think the same is true for Ferrari as well. So, look, we'll see. Often, at least we've seen in recent times, Mercedes upgrades in Canada have actually tend to work quite well. Not like that's really something to look for, but, just generally, Mercedes upgrades they've brought in the ground effect era at this time in the season have usually done something. So we'll see if that continues to be true. But George Russell's future is one of the big questions in Formula One right now, because as it stands, he does not have a contract for 2026. And this weekend, we got, I don't know if Max would have done what he did if it wasn't George. If it was somebody else, he may not have done. Obviously, he was furious inside the cockpit. But the fact that it was George that, of course, pushed him off the track at the first corner, and then he let through, but, decided eventually not to let through at turn 5. If it was some other driver, if it was some, let's say inane driver who Max hasn't had any friction with, if it was Alonso, would he have done it? Probably not. I think the fact that it was Russell made it more likely something like this would indeed occur. There was an interesting article here, though, that kind of went through some of the details again on the collision. I don't want to go through it much more than we already have, but because I think we've discussed pretty much all sides of it. The big debate still, it's a talking point because it's one of the biggest events so far this season, and the idea of a deliberate collision is something that we don't see particularly often, especially not from a reigning world champion. So anyway, there was discussion in the article. I thought it was interesting, talking about the brake test on Hamilton 2021. Of course, people have their perspective on each side of that. Running his rivals off the road, Brazil, Mexico, there's not really too much debate on that. But what I thought was interesting here was the discussion on what the stewards said, because the stewards said this: the driver of car 1 was clearly unhappy with his team's request to give the position back. At the approach to turn 5, car 1 significantly reduced its speed, thereby appearing to allow car 63 to overtake. However, after car 63 got ahead of car 1 at the entry of turn 5, car 1 suddenly accelerated and collided with car 63. The collision was undoubtedly caused by the actions of car 1. Of course, the actions of the driver of car 1, right? It wasn't remote, AI-controlled machinery, which actually the writer of the article does say. It's somewhat, it is standard terminology, right? So, this is what they say. It's not, it's not unusual for them to say this, but, it's still pretty funny. But, of course, what's interesting about this is the stewards, the way that they write it effectively implies a deliberate collision, but of course they've not said that and they've not punished it as such, although his penalty points being 3 rather than the standard 2 maybe says something as well. It's just been a big debate, hasn't it, right? Like, there's lots of talk about how Max has, done several things over several years, and maybe if he's been punished, maybe more leniently than he should have done. And this is where we are today. The reality is, however, Max is still the best driver on the grid. He's still the fastest driver on the grid. On, let's say, 90% of race weekends, he will absolutely maximise what the car is capable of, and he's capable of pulling out, frankly, miracle results from a car that is clearly fast in the right hands, but, what we saw in Suzuka, what we saw in Imola, are results that I don't really think any other driver could achieve right now. And that's why you get Flavio Briatore saying, and I thought this quote was fake, and I looked into it, and I think it's real. I might be wrong, but I think it's real. Briatore was asked the question, I think anyway, what do you need to do to win? And Briatore said, sign Max. I'd sign 2 of him if I could and put them in both of my cars. And it's almost comical, but that's kind of the point. Now, Toto Wolff, as good as he is as a team principal, and as much as he likes George, and as good as I think George is, I would love to see a world where we have a Russell Verstappen title fight. I mean, it would get tense, and it would get dramatic, and incidents like what we had on Sunday would be occurring again. So I really hope that at some point in the next, 2 to 3 years, maybe longer than that, who knows, we get a proper Russell-Max title fight, because it would be mega. Now, how that would unfold is a bit of a question mark, because what teams are they going to be driving for? And that is currently the big question. Toto was critical of Max, for sure, said that it was road rage, like the taxi drivers in Rome or Naples. There's a lot of aggression in the centre of Rome and Naples without rules, kind of describing Max's driving. Now, again, this is one of those replies that seems almost comical, too good to be true parody. But Loreno Bittarelli, who's the president of Rome's largest taxi cooperative, said, perhaps Mr. Wolff should concentrate on his own team's performance. We drive like a Mercedes, only going 30 miles an hour, just like them. I'd like to see F1 drivers maneuver around construction sites, scooters and golf carts like we do. So basically, the Italian taxi drivers weren't very happy about getting their driving compared to Verstappen's, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. But the big question still remains, is Russell going anywhere? Is Max going to take his seat? Because right now he doesn't have a drive for next year. Russell evidently wants to stay at Mercedes, but Toto not being so forthright to heavily criticise Max, even as we saw yesterday, Marco was probably more critical of Max than Toto was, certainly at the time. And that's his own driver who got punted out and got some damage that maybe costed him getting the chance to go even further up the grid. Now, yesterday, there was a rumour going around that Russell had removed his, basically Mercedes from his Instagram bio. I made a video about it on TikTok because I thought, well, if it's fake news, I'll just talk about it in the video today on YouTube, which is what I'm going to do, because it turns out that for some time now, it's not been there. Mercedes AMG F1 has not been in his bio. But even if it was true that he had it there and he removed it, it wouldn't have meant anything other really than his management trying to put a bit of pressure on Toto, I think, in Mercedes to actually make a decision on the matter, right? So Toto Wolff has hinted very recently that Russell will get a new contract. Effectively, before, during the summer break. Obviously, right now, there's quite a lot going on. But, Toto Wolff has said that, we plan to keep George and we will sign the contract in the next couple of months. That's what effectively Toto has said. Now, George has made it very clear and continues to do so that staying at Mercedes is absolutely the intention. Of course, my intention is to continue with Mercedes. This is where I want to be. Nothing would make me happier than winning, presumably, a championship with Mercedes. And George is, in many respects, the perfect fit for Mercedes, just the way that he is, right? His personality, the way that he carries himself, the way that he talks. I don't know. I think, George and Mercedes are a great fit. And he's also an excellent driver, and I think at times gets rather underrated. Max, though, is Max Verstappen, right? And that's the thing. Max will go down as one of the greatest, however controversial, drivers of all time in Formula One. And George, George may be a champion, but he's never going to go down as a great, a Senna, a Schumacher, a Hamilton, a Fangio, Jim Clark, and Verstappen, potentially, right? he's never going to quite be in that category. And when you get the opportunity to sign someone like that to your team, then Toto Wolff, to do his job right, has to at least contemplate what that means. There would be serious repercussions of that. Like if you sign Max, you open Pandora's box, I think, on some level to what that might mean for your team. George, you don't have any of those political issues. And if I'm Toto, I think my conclusion is that next year, I'm very confident in the machine. We probably don't need Max. Like, I think if I'm Toto, I think I'm sticking with George. I think that's what I would do. Just because there's such confidence, it seems, in Mercedes that they won't necessarily need the Verstappen factor, as Marco would call it. Because, the car, the engine, presumably is going to be very solid. There's been lots of talk about the W17 as it will be. Rosberg says already 75% of resources are going towards 2026. This season is no longer a priority, and the W17 gives the biggest opportunity to really jump ahead. Of course, there's lots of talk about the engine and all of that. So, that will be Mercedes' opportunity. And I think that if Toto's confident in the project they've put together there, then keeping George and Kimi is probably the more sensible approach. But I think, I'm pretty torn on this. If Max was to want to leave Red Bull and go to Mercedes, of course, because, again, what Max has achieved and continues to achieve is rather remarkable. Also kind of remarkable that Russell has led 0 laps so far this season, despite consistently being P3 most of the Grand Prix. But that's where we're going to leave it for today. What would you do if you were in Toto Wolff's position right now, especially if Max indeed is on the phone to say, hey, Red Bull are pissing me off. I want to come and drive for Mercedes because you've probably got a great package next year. It's a difficult decision, but it's a decision Mercedes have to make in the next couple of months. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.